famously said about how sometimes decades go by and nothing seems to happen, and then weeks go by and decades seem to happen, and that seems to be what's happening with the struggle of our class right now against all kinds of attacks and oppression, from Gaza and Ukraine to the border in Mexico and the U.S., with the children being held hostage by the United States, and right here in Staten Island with the murder of Eric Garner. So I think it's important to start out on this topic of the Malaysian Airlines crash in Ukraine last week by saying unequivocally that we reject the U.S. and Kiev government's story about what happened, their immediate move to put blame on the rebels in southeast Ukraine in the People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk, as well as the Russian government, and to escalate the war fever against Russia. In fact, you know, we've said in the Workers' World Statement issued right afterward, and also in other writings since then, you know, we don't have any special information that's not available to others, but that you know, we need to counter the narrative and point out that there's no logical reason why the rebels or Russia would target an airliner in this situation. On the contrary, it goes against everything that they've been trying to do to break their isolation and expose the U.S. and the Kiev government's role in massive civilian crimes against civilians in southeast Ukraine. It just gives more ammunition to the imperialists and their puppets in Kiev. But since that time, that story has actually unraveled rather dramatically and has continued to do so today, and I'll get into that a little later. I wanted to report, because you know, so much is happening, as we know, in all of these developing struggles, and it's no different in Ukraine. I wanted to report some good news that came out this afternoon, which is that the independent British journalist Graham Phillips, who was taken hostage by the fascist National Guard in Donetsk earlier this week, was released unharmed today and deported home to Britain. He was captured by the National Guard at the airport in Donetsk on Tuesday, along with 3 others, including a camera person for anti-fascist website called Anna News. The camera person was released first, but it was tortured. And people were really worried after his release, you know, what had happened to Graham Phillips, because you know, there was just no indication of what had happened. But probably because he was British, of his British citizenship, he was released unharmed. He's banned for 3 years from entering Ukraine. He had been kicked out of Ukraine a couple of months ago by the regime also. I would say he's probably the only English language reporter who's been to the region, who's done credible work throughout the whole crisis this year. And we're very glad to hear that he's safe. Comrades and friends have probably heard that major steps have been taken by the regime in Kiev to formally ban the Communist Party of Ukraine, which they've been moving towards for some time. On Tuesday night, the Speaker of the Parliament, the Rada, who was previously the interim president before the bogus elections that were held in May, sent a bill to the current President Poroshenko which he signed, which basically rewrote the rules of the parliament to give the speaker the right to dissolve any group of elected officials, basically, of any party in the parliament. And this was immediately enacted against the Communist Party, abolishing their fraction of 23 elected members as of yesterday. And the party had basically been de facto banned, even though they kept showing up at the parliament. They hadn't actually been able to participate. But this now is a formal step. And also yesterday, court proceedings began to ban the Communist Party, period, throughout the country. And that is expected to move forward in August. And we have a statement that Workers' World issued this morning. It's on the website, condemning the moves to ban the Communist Party. The same time that the president of Ukraine was signing this bill, this profoundly anti-democratic measure, in Donetsk, the National Guard had kidnapped, tortured, and murdered a 58-year-old Communist Party activist. His name was Vyacheslav Kovshin. He was the secretary of a local party chapter in the village of Glinsky in Donetsk. And this is his picture, which I got today from a comrade who attended his funeral. They were... It's an interesting thing because, the picture is kind of old and blurry, and she said that, she was taking a picture with her cell phone of photos that were arrayed on the casket. And, she said, sorry that this is such a, not such a great photo, but there really weren't any, up-to-date kind of photos. It gives you a sense of what this person was about as a working class leader in this area of Donbass, an industrial and mining area that's really been devastated by the privatization since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence, so-called independence of Ukraine in 1991. This was someone, obviously, who's with limited technological access in an area with limited technological access, not someone who is taking selfies at demos and things like that, like we're used to these days. But I wanted to bring it and share it with comrades to put a human face on what's happening there, because just like in Gaza, it's real living people and revolutionaries and comrades who are dying in this assault by the fascists. So when the airliner went down last Thursday, within hours, the story had come out from Kiev blaming Russia and the rebels. And at first there wasn't really a differentiation. There, it was like, well, did Russia shoot it down? Did they give weapons to the rebels? Within a day, the line had been set for bourgeois public opinion worldwide that it was weapons supplied by Russia to the rebels who had shot down the plane. And as to a motive, it was revenge for sanctions against Russia or something along that line. Within 24 hours of the plane going down, President Obama had made a statement officially, endorsing this position, saying Russia was to blame and the rebels had shot down the plane. And Cameron and Britain, so on, they all chimed in on this. even though no investigation had happened, no one had arrived at the crash scene yet. They were all, ready to endorse these unspecified security intelligence sources that were quoted, right? The fix was in, and, probably for the next 20 years, we'll all be hearing about how Russia and the rebels were responsible, no matter what facts come out. But the facts are starting to come out relatively quickly, and that's good, because it puts the imperialists on the defensive. It puts the fascists on the defensive. It was alleged that the rebels had shot down the plane with something called a Buck anti-aircraft battery that they had gotten supposedly had gotten the system from Russia. A Buck is a huge, sophisticated piece of equipment, and one battery does not operate by itself. It requires a whole big system of batteries, as well as auxiliary systems, which immediately cast doubt on the story that was coming out of Washington and Kiev, because the sophistication required of this sort of ragtag volunteer people's militia, and the equipment, the ability to run the equipment, there was no previous intelligence reports that would indicate that was even possible. The rebels were known to have captured one Buck battery from the Ukrainian army. They actually paraded it through Donetsk at a demonstration, but to operate it by itself without all the attendant equipment, it just didn't make sense. It also didn't make sense that the U.S. could not provide any satellite photography showing that these huge batteries had come across the border from Russia. However, the Ukrainian army did have an active Buck system in the region. Why? Since the People's Militia of Donetsk and Lugansk has no air force, would they have it there is a big question that still has not been answered. The Ukrainian authorities issued some very amateurish evidence, such as an audio recording alleging to be the militia leaders in one area bragging about having shot down the plane. In fact, it was quickly shown by bloggers on the internet that it had been stitched together from 3 different recordings and was completely bogus. Similarly, they released photographs that people online were asking, did they just pull this off of Google Maps and insert some icons into it? They also released photos of their own Buck anti-aircraft system, claiming it belonged to the rebels, and so it was like this whole ridiculous thing. Meanwhile, though, the headlines around the world, and if you happen to look at the Daily News and the Post here in New York, or the British tabloids over the last week, every day it's like, Vlad killed my child, Putin's thugs, shoot down plane. It's like no attempt to reflect what's actually coming out. Again, we say, there's no definitive proof one way or the other yet, but certainly all of the indicators are that this was something that happened because of the Ukrainian military, whether deliberately or accidentally. The latest story released today is that someone in the Ukrainian military, an unnamed source, has apparently said, well, it could have been an accidental result of war games that we were conducting in the region, which is a pretty big admission. At the same time, what's coming out of Washington is a new line, basically saying, not assigning direct blame, but saying Russia is responsible for creating the war, and now Russia is planning to send a whole new big shipment of heavy weapons to the rebels. If only that were true, that would be awesome. Unfortunately, there's no indication of that. The Russians are scared, understandably so, and acting in a very cautious way. Some would say too cautious about providing assistance to the rebels. But we can say with confidence that in the tiny off chance that it actually somehow, by some miracle or accident, that the rebels were responsible for downing this plane, tragic though it was an accident only. There's no evidence to indicate that they did it. And it fits, in fact, a pattern of the U.S. using incidents like these to create war hysteria or gather information on an opponent, or both, such as, I remember when I was 12 years old in 1983, we had what was the closest thing, I think, since then to the Bay of, not the Bay of Pigs, but the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the KAL 007 airliner that was shot down over the Soviet Union after it was deliberately sent in violation of Soviet airspace by the U.S. And for a period of a couple of days there, it was like, nuclear war is imminent. As it turned out, it came out, a few months later that, this was all a U.S. Intelligence scheme to gather information on Soviet air defenses, which turned out were really good, unfortunately for the folks who were on the plane. But also we should not forget in 1988 that the U.S. With malice aforethought shot down an Iranian airliner in the Middle East, where the U.S. had no business being in the first place. George H.W. Bush, who was the vice president and then running for president, pointedly said, "I will not apologize for the United States, no matter what the facts are." So this, and also most people don't know, but in 2001, Ukraine actually shot down a Russian airliner by mistake, killing all aboard. So this, the way that this has been handled from the beginning fits in with what the United States has been doing around Ukraine since the Euromaidan movement began last year, since the U.S. funded and backed coup in February, since the launch of this horrible war against civilians in the southeast, and the persecution of communists and leftists and anti-fascists throughout Ukraine. It's worth what we have a couple minutes. I just want to go over some other developments that are closely related to the plane, because this is all unfolding very quickly right in front of us. In May and June, the most right-wing grouping of oligarchs in Ukraine, who are grouped around this guy, Igor Kolomoisky, in the city of Dnepropetrovsk, basically set up their own kind of enclave to harbor the right sector and other fascist militias and things like that. And it's widely believed that they were responsible for the massacre in Odessa, for sending the shock troops that carried out the fascist burning down of the House of Trade Unions on May 2nd, killing over 40 people inside. And they've been in tension with Poroshenko and some of the other elements in Kiev. There's been a struggle within the coup regime. And a lot of the fascists in Kiev and outside of Kiev are very unhappy with all of the setbacks militarily since Poroshenko took over. Of course, their own shock troops are on the front lines, so why they're criticizing him is a question. They themselves are open to criticism for that. There was, in June, reportedly, negotiations behind the scenes among some of the more moderate elements in Donetsk with the oligarch Rinat Akhmetov, who is from Donetsk, and some elements of the government in Moscow to try to come up with a compromise that would basically undermine the independence of Donetsk, but find some accommodation with the junta in Kiev that would prevent or that would take the pressure off from the war. This compromise was not agreed to by the majority of the leadership in Donetsk, and it was reportedly, this comes from a reliable communist military analyst in Ukraine. We can't confirm it, but I think it's important context, is that when the Donetsk militia under Igor Strelkov withdrew from the city of Slavyansk on July 4th, around July 4th, and retreated to Donetsk, refusing to sort of be captured and surrounded and decimated, that put the kibosh on this agreement, because the more militant sector in Donetsk was strengthened by Strelkov's and the militia's return. Last week, one day before the downing of the plane, the militia had a great military victory in breaking the Ukrainian army's attempt to surround and cut off the city of Donetsk. They pushed them back into a small area near the Russian border where they had only the option to retreat or be captured, and they retreated. The next day, the plane was shot down. Tuesday, the law to ban the Communist Party was rushed through Parliament and signed by Poroshenko, perhaps to try to appease the furthest right elements. But yesterday, the fascist party Svoboda and its ally Udar withdrew from the government coalition, basically leaving the parliament hung and unable to pass any further legislation until a new government is formed. Yatsenyuk, the prime minister who was chosen by the United States and is their principal spokesperson in the government, resigned. And so this situation is kind of unfolding as we speak. But I think we have to put the plane crash in this context of this crisis within the ruling regime in Kiev, a military crisis, a political crisis, and underlying it all, the oncoming economic crisis as Ukraine starts to implement the IMF austerity plan forced on it by the EU and the US, and faces a real crisis coming in just a few months when the cold weather starts to set in and they no longer have cheap Russian fuel on easy credit. From now on, Russia's demanding payment up front for any fuel, and this is going to create a real deep crisis for working people in Ukraine, but also for the regime. I just wanted to say finally that our comrades from Borotba are active, doing what they can, where they can. As we've spoken about here before, many of them were forced to leave the cities that they were working in the southeast and retreat to Donetsk and Crimea under threat of arrest or execution. But we're heartened by the news that there is work going on in Donetsk and Lugansk between Borotba, members of the Communist Party of Ukraine, and other forces to form a new Communist Party of Donbass in the near future, a united party that they hope will be able to have, give the left and the working class a much more influential voice in the running of the people's republics going forward. And we salute them. We salute the comrades who are on the front lines there every day, as we do with our comrades in Palestine. And we say, U.S., get out now.